feel like you belong somewhere. To be with other people, probably perhaps who understand some of what you've been through. And then, how do you think your religious background influenced you as a little kid?
It's basically your entire being. It's your foundation. It's how you make judgments. If that's what you've been brought up with, that's your. I mean, I've been out of this cult for 30 some odd years, and it still influenced me. So it is the foundation. It's like what Michael Jackson used to say, that he never had a childhood. It messed him up for the rest of his life. So it is the very foundation. And it's a strong foundation, unfortunately.
So it's really built in pretty deep, right? Yeah. And it was somebody else. Okay.
We have this love-hate relationship going over here. So, honestly, Tony, I feel like my perception of reality is distorted in general. It started with my childhood. And so, in all honesty.
Like, perception of reality is distorted.
Yes.
Okay. Foundation for what you believe. How do you think it's distorted? Yeah. How do you think?
First off, Jehovah's Witnesses, the very foundation that they teach is that everybody's going to be destroyed in Armageddon. And they teach you that the world is wicked and that there are no kind, loving people out there, that only in Jehovah's organization, aka Jehovah's Witnesses, are you going to find peace and serenity and love and happiness. And anything they're outside of, you will be miserable. The exact terminology that they like to use is weeping and gnashing of your teeth.
What now?
Weeping and gnashing of your teeth.
It's what you're going to get later.
No, if you leave Jehovah's organization. So you are only find happiness and fulfillment inside of the organization, and that is it.
So basically, you pull this. It's like the Wizard of Oz. And you pull that curtain, and I said, oh my God, I have been fucking lied to all my life. And you're just pissed because you've been lied to, because there are good people out there. There are bad people too. And if you have been brought up whatever way, that you can discern between good and bad, good and evil. That's the whole premise. But without them, you can't decide. You're just so weak that you're going to just choose evil.
Okay. So then that it's difficult, apparently, to distinguish the childhood religious influence from the adult religious influence. Is that right? I mean,
just want to clarify one thing. Not everyone was raised as a Jehovah's Witness, so it'd be good to also address the fact that there are some folks here that were also not raised in it, so they came into it themselves later on, and then left. So I just want to make sure that we have those folks in this conversation as well.
I'm curious about what you think the motivation would be for somebody who came into the Jehovah's Witnesses.
I can tell you that because I was not raised as one of Jehovah's Witnesses. I came into it voluntarily. And in fact, I started studying the Bible, and it answered some questions that I'd been having in my life. And then it's a progressive learning. And then I actually did benefit a lot from that. I started becoming more aware. But I think at that point, if I would have studied Buddhism, I would have become more aware. But it just happened this was it. And it was filling a need that I had. And then I was married at the time, so then my husband started studying. He became a nicer person than what we had been doing. And then we ended up raising our kids in it. And my kids now have been raised as Jehovah's Witnesses from, my oldest son was 3, I think 2 or 3. And he's 32 now. But for me, I have similar feelings as these guys that were raised as one of Jehovah's Witnesses, because it's still like deeply ingrained. And I still struggle with many things because I think they're bad, or I'm bad, or, you know, I don't feel I'm going to be destroyed for them. But the first 5 years I was out, I kind of did, and I was like, well, if Jehovah kills me, then it's righteous, and if he doesn't, then, hey, that's great too. So it's still deeply, I've been out about 10 years away from that. And, yeah, it's still, every day is just, it's hard to explain. As I try to explain it to new people I'm meeting that have no idea what it is, they're like, it doesn't make sense. And I'm like, I know.
I'm also one of the other few who became one of Jehovah's Witnesses. I was actually still pretty young when I did, but I think what attracted it to me was I wasn't raised with any particular religious upbringing, and my parents didn't really give me a whole lot of guidance in being brought up. So I think for most people, it's like there's a need. You have a need, you have an emptiness or something that's lacking, and they happen to be there, and they offer something that sounds really good at the time. And I think to echo your comment, Debbie, you know, had it been some other religion, I probably would have, you know, gotten involved with that, because most of them teach something good. They teach morality and so forth, and there's a lot of good things that are taught by Jehovah's Witnesses. You know, my whole thing is I don't want to demonize the entire thing, because, you know, not all of it was bad. I definitely brought some very good things. I think I'm a better person in a lot of ways as a result of my association. But it served a need at that time. But then you start getting more involved and so forth, and you start seeing some of the stuff that's not quite so, because there's still a human element, and nothing's perfect with any human organization. And then you put additional pressures on people, and they crack, and they do some really crazy things. So, but as far as for me, I think there was a lot of stuff, especially sexually, that got pushed into my head, especially since I had to deal with the whole gay issue.
Yeah.
Without realizing it, I had to suppress that, a really important part of myself. I think that did some damage that I'm still dealing with today.
Yeah. So let me ask you, everybody's gay? Okay. Either way, you're all messed up. Just don't forget that.
So, you know, I was going to mention, like, whether you were raised or you came into the religion voluntarily, I think one of the things that you end up learning is some of what kind of gets you is because they're able to show you how the doctrines of other Christian religions are false. You know, it's like, okay, Mary wasn't a virgin, you know, and that for a lot of Catholics is really important. I mean, my mom was a I don't know what they call it, Mary worshiper or whatever, where she really liked the Virgin Mary, and then finding out that she had other children, and then, you know, the Trinity. And so when you have a couple of 4 or 5, you know, hey, they got it right here, they got it right here, they got it right here, and you know, holidays are pagan in origin, they got it right here. So if homosexuality must be wrong, then they must got it right there, but it doesn't feel right within me. So there's that's where the conflicts start coming in, is because some of the doctrines were so on the money, and then you're figuring, well, are all of them? And then you're taught to think that, you know, hey, we've told you at least 10 of these, you know, things were right, and now you only have issues with one. So then that's where it starts creeping in, and then you're told if you start questioning it, then you are one who opposes the organization, or the word apostate. So I think that's how it kind of gets us.
Well, so it sounds like, I mean, essentially, let me tell you a little of my background. I grew up in well, my mother still is at 90-something, Assembly of God, and one of those really, really kind of whacked out kind of fundamentalist churches. On the other hand, my dad was Methodist and didn't give a damn one way or the other, you know. And so I come from that background, and then I also have an undergraduate degree in music, which includes a degree in sacred music, which also implies a major in theology. Okay, so I've got all that kind of background, and then I worked in churches for about 25 years, or maybe a little longer, and put up with all that bullshit from the inside. Okay, and then in addition to that, I spent 20 years on the couch before I went back to school and got retreaded, and now I've been in practice about 30 years. So, and curiously enough, for reasons that entirely escape me, I've always seen a large number of fundamentalist clergy. Now, I don't know why in the hell they come to a gay therapist. We can all guess. But, so, yeah. So my practice is made up primarily, we were laughing over drinks last night, more than a third of the people I see are lawyers, and that's kind of across the board. And then about 10 or 15% of them are doctors. I see a bunch of university profs, business owners, and clergy. And that's who I see, and it's been that way for 20 years. So it's a really, really interesting practice. But no matter what happens, eventually the whole religious background thing comes up. And interestingly enough, the clergy always stop at that point. That's when they decide they've done enough work and they never come back. But I think it's most helpful that, oh, by the way, this is my partner, Bruce Smith. the dental part, yeah. The dental and gentle. Yeah, it's really funny. Yeah, he recognized your tooth, huh? Got it. We were at a favorite restaurant one night, and the waitress came over and tapped on Bruce's shoulder, and he left, and I got really worried after he'd been gone for like half an hour, because I thought, my God, this is like the most serious dental emergency I've ever heard of. Well, so I finally went to look for him, and I found him in the bar. He's not on the bar stool, but the barmaid is on the bar stool, right back like this. Bruce has a flashlight, looking. Well, no, Doris, our dear Doris waitress, had come over and said, "My friend has a toothache. Could you look at this?" It's kind of the way he is. Okay. I think the most helpful thing of all that I could do right now is to do for you is to kind of do a little quick overview of how how we develop. So this is basically like Developmental Psychology 101, Cliff Note version. And if we understand that, then it makes it much, much easier not only to see how the our idiosyncrasies develop, it also makes it much easier to understand how our particular personality styles develop and how they really are adaptations to the environment in which we grew up. And pretty much any way you cut it, that's always includes some sort of religious beliefs, whether in this country, whether they're formalized or not. And different groups, oh God, I'm going to move around forever. I'll try to be still, but it's not going to happen. So all of these things impact us in lots and lots of ways. However, the more we know about the development of it, the easier it is to make the changes to get away from it. That make enough sense to you? So let's just start with some of the things that we know. And there's precious little that we absolutely know about human development, but we do know these things. People are born completely dependent, and we stay that way longer than a living being. Born with no knowledge. We're born with no instinct, unlike what we used to think. We're basically born with only the most fundamental drives. But we're also born with an amazing ability to learn very, very quickly. And an acute sensitivity to discomfort. We're totally helpless. The only thing we can do is make noise, basically. So, then if you consider, and we know even less about what's going on in utero, but the assumption is that if the fetus is aware of anything, it's fairly comfortable. The temperature is about right. It's dark in there. It's kind of quiet. You get what you want, I guess, in terms of food or something. But at the moment of birth, everything changes. Big head, little hole. This has got to be a bad deal on either end, in my mind. Baby pops out. The room is cold. The surfaces are hard. It's bright. It's noisy. Doc grabs the kid by the ankles, yanks it up in the air, and whacks it on the butt. Bam, our first experience with life then is pain. Then the next thing that happens is that baby gets put in a crib, and somebody has to figure out how to take care of this kid. Now, they're doing the best they can, but they're guessing all the time. So from the very, very moment of life, we're experiencing both pain and enormous frustration. So baby cries because he's cold, and somebody thinks he's hungry. Baby cries because he's got a bellyache, and somebody thinks it's an earache. Or baby cries because he's wet, and somebody thinks he wants to be held. So there's this enormous, enormous frustration that begins from the very moment of birth. Well, within the first few days of birth, then, this tiny little thing has to start developing ways of coping with all of this frustration. So, if the personality is to come together, essentially, and solidify, then it's all about the baby learning to manage this frustration. So, personality styles then and coping styles begin in just the first few hours of life, and they're pretty much in place by the time we're about 4 years old. Now, the details aren't there, but the style is there. So, then if there's some other kind of really weird things that we'll come back and talk about in a minute, but think about, what's got to be going on in this tiny, tiny little being who has no knowledge and no anything, trying to cope with this awful frustration. Now, by the time does that make sense so far? Okay, if you fast forward then to adolescence and a young adulthood, by now, the way we cope with frustration has finally sort of solidified into what we call now either defense mechanisms or coping mechanisms. Okay, so by adulthood, these have fallen into two very, very large groups. There are the kind of behavioral / addictive coping mechanisms, and the intellectual and emotional coping mechanisms. Now, let's go back and talk about what that really means. Okay, a coping mechanism is simply the way we manage something that's difficult for us. So, the typical, we all know somebody who drinks too much. We all know somebody who uses drugs too much. We all know somebody who spends money too much. We all know people who have sex too much. We all know people who work out too much. Damn it, I hate every one of them. But all of those things too much. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with the mechanism itself. It's simply the way it's being used that becomes later on becomes problematic. Now, does that make sense so far? So let me show you kind of a simple little diagram of how this stuff works. Basically, we go along talking about things or thinking about things. We touch a place that's sensitive. We get choked up, we feel like crying, we get mad, we get embarrassed, anything like that. And what we do, we all do the same thing, exactly. We find some way to get away from that sensitive spot. So we talk about something else, or we think about something else, or we go shopping, or we go online, or we pick up the phone, or whatever it is we do, anything that gets us away from that little sensitive spot. Does anybody not know what I'm talking about with the sensitive spot? Okay, so that all works. All right, now, these little sensitive places are all the result of life experiences. They also develop very, very, very early. And they're very much a part of our personalities. So they're so much a part of us that we don't know anything about them. Everybody around us knows. I'll do something really stupid, and then when I finally notice it, I'll say to Bruce, "My God, I don't believe I did that." And he goes, "Oh, I knew you were going to," because that's what you always do. Well, these are all so much a part of our personality then that we're completely oblivious to them. However, they all develop, see, as the begin from this real early part of the development. Is this making enough sense? All right. Now, what this also means is that, first of all, no two of us have the same set of sensitive spots. What's devastating to me may have no meaning at all to you, and vice versa. And then the way I get away from this sensitive place is also quite unique to me. So it kind of looks like this. We go along talking about things or thinking about things or we're doing whatever it is, and all of a sudden some kind of painful experience happens. It's what we call feeling defensive, usually. And the very second that happens, we respond to it in some way. But it usually means changing direction, doing something different from what we were doing. That goes very far. Then it sort of starts to spiral, and we just do more and more and more and more of whatever this is. Now, the real question then is what would happen if we kept going this way? What is it back here that's so sensitive that we're doing all of this to get away from it? Are we okay so far? Making sense? Okay, so this is what we call defense mechanisms. And their entire function, then, is to keep us distracted from whatever it is over here that's so painful or threatening to us in some way. Now, here's what goes on. Somebody's going along, they have a really tough time, boom, they just grab a drink. Well, when it gets to be problematic, they just drink more and more and more and more, and it gets hard to stop. Okay, now this is sort of a little aside, and it's easy illustration. Have you ever known anyone who went to AA? Anybody? Yeah. Okay, real effective for some people, not effective at all for others. But this is not an indictment of AA, it's just the way things are. Obviously, for those people, alcohol is a part of the defensive structure. It's a part of how they're coping. Well, for some people, when you take away the alcohol, the pain over here is so great they can't stand it. So they go back to drinking. Or they find some other way of coping with it. I've always thought that it makes more sense, rather than to attack the defense, the protective device, to look at whatever this is, take care of this so it's no longer so painful or threatening, then we're not so driven to this. Now, does that make enough sense? Okay. So, the behavioral ones are like that. We do it too much. Intellectual defenses and emotional defenses have exactly the same function. But we get to a place that's in some way threatening to us, and we immediately do something else. Now, how many times have you heard this? My God, everything is just so fucked up. I don't think it'll ever get right, but I can't do anything about that. I may as well just, no reason to keep thinking about that. Or, people who are suicidal go, wow, everything is just miserable. I thought I had it all right, but now this is just more of the same. It's just going to get worse and worse and worse and worse. It'll never be any better. I don't know why I even try. I may as well just kill myself and get it over with. Well, so what do you think religious people do? Bang. We hit something threatening, and we simply quickly lapse into recitations of religious belief. So, does that make enough sense? Or what else? I mean, how many of those can you tell me about? Hundreds of them, I'm sure. Well, it's not only religious people who do that, lots of other people too. However, there's some funny things that get built into religious belief that are a little bit different. And well, let's think about this. What are the things that you think are most painful to people? What is it we're most afraid of? Dying. Fundamentally, death is the deepest fear. It appears to be a very, very fundamental fear. The main goal of all living beings is simply to survive, right? So that means our goal is to defy death. All right. Now, so religion develops when? How long ago? As early as we know anything about humanity, right? Well, so has the fear of death apparently was there too. That's what kept people from standing still when tigers came walking up. It's not rocket science stuff, but the reassurance then, and this is really touchy stuff. So if it pisses you off, just tell me that, and we'll work through that too. But maybe, essentially, death means a lot of things. It means not getting finished with what you started, not getting around to the things you hope to get around to. But it means some other things too. Maybe the most fundamental pain is the fear of being separated from those we love. I can tell you, I've never seen a couple in therapy who was having a really hard time where it wasn't really underneath it all about the fear of being separated. Then you go beyond that, and there is the absolute, undeniable belief that at some point in our lives, one of us is going to die and leave the other, right? Unless we're lucky enough to go down in a plane crash, and that doesn't happen very often, right? So what do we have to do then? We need, in some fundamental way, something that tells us we're not going to have to suffer the pain of death. Religion. Yeah. And we need something that assures us that we will not remain separated in afterlife. Well, I mean, what better way is there, to manipulate and control people, or also to give some sort of comfort, right, than to say, hey, here's the way to avoid what's going on here, what's inevitable. What generally has to happen, and it's interesting, as people age and approach death, the obvious end of life, in various ways, they simply become a little bit more comfortable with the idea that this is the way things are. People who kind of know this from the beginning tend to live life very, very fully. They don't put off things, and they don't waste a lot of time on superficial shit. They're down to, they really know that you got to live. Okay. So anyway, keep this stuff in mind. Looking puzzled. Does that make sense? Not make sense. Yeah. All right. Now, a couple of other things. Let's go back to when we start developing these coping mechanisms. So how old were you when you first had some very, very strange, vague sense that you might be different? Five, 8, 4. Okay. Now, how old were you when you figured out you're gay? 21. Yeah. So most men who do real in-depth therapies usually say that by the time they're about 4 years old, they have this clear sense that they are different. They don't know what it is, but very, very clear sense of being different. Women usually talk about it a little bit later, but not always. So what's happening then? Here we are, a 4-year-old kid And we start to have this vague, vague sense that we're different from the way other people want us to be. So, it's wonderful. We develop this ability to look different on the outside we are on the inside. And all sorts of interesting things happen from that. You know, one of the nice things when you get kind of grown up is that we're a hell of a lot more charming than most people. You know, we can deal with most things. Everybody thinks we're all happy and we have everything working. You know, everybody thinks we've got millions of friends that we feel close and loved and like we fit into this mystical world they don't know anything about, and that everything's fine. Well, what's going on then? Here you got this tall who's figured out that she's different. She knows that she can't go in and say, "Mom, what's wrong? I want to kiss Jane." So she kind of sucks it up and doesn't talk about that. She starts to figure out all of this stuff all by herself, right? Well, this really, really fundamental change starts about, or difference starts about then. And as we grow up, gay people, first of all, become more and more skillful at looking different. So, and this is not a deceitful kind of thing, it's a matter of survival. Okay, and then we also wind up having to rely on ourselves to learn to cope with extremely difficult, complex situations without the benefit of adult experience and adult input. So by the time we're about 15 or 16 or 18 or whatever it is, now we all of a sudden know this. I know what I want to do, and this is really not right. The fantasy, or not right with the people around me, the fantasy is always kind of the same. Someday I'll meet another man who's like me, I'll fall in love, I'll find this will be somebody who understands me, we'll be just alike, and everything will be wonderful from now on. Yeah. Well, all kinds of weird stuff happens about that time, but the most fundamentally difficult part is that when we meet this other person and fall in love, what have we got? We've got two people who are so unaccustomed to relying on another person. They're totally unaccustomed to the sense of safety of letting another person know exactly who we are. So this develops all these really, really difficulties of authenticity and simply trying to learn to be with somebody else. And what's really going on is that we're scared to death. We've also had, by now, a lifelong experience of knowing or believing that if other people know what we're really like, they won't like us. And that's the nicest part. Does that make sense so far? Okay. Now, then some other things happen kind of depending on the family you grow up in. Some families are way more tolerant of individualism and difference than others. Okay, if you grew up in a fundamentalist religious family, the entire emphasis is on conformity. Just do what you're told. There's some other things that go on, like, do you know what swaddling is? Okay. So it's a really, really interesting phenomenon that lots and lots of people in child development and sociologic development are looking at a whole lot now, because this practice is so that it's gone on almost as long as we know anything about civilization. Babies are born and they get wrapped really tight so they can't move. Well, now how fucking comfortable is that? Huh? Not very at all. There were also early Christian beliefs, very, very early Christian beliefs, that infants are evil. And it was real common to see pentagons and all sorts of things painted on cribs to keep the evil spirits, you'd think, away from the baby, right? No, the idea was to keep the evil spirits from invading the household because of the baby. Yeah, right. So, boom, here's this belief, this real fundamental belief that children are evil. So it reinforces the belief that you got to make them better, which means different from the way they are. The more religious beliefs there are, generally, the less nurturing people are. The more punishing they are, the more rigid they are in the way they do things, room it leaves, and the less it encourages children to think for themselves as they're growing up. Does it make sense? And then when you build in some of the stuff that gets built into, particularly to Christian belief, there's all this stuff that says, I know the answer, you don't, and if you disagree with me, your ass is going to burn. What better way is there? We were, and this, by the way, this concept of fire is phenomenal. We were in Italy a few years ago with a couple who are both geologists, and they had just come back from a long time in Africa, and this was, remember that horrible period, I've forgotten where it was, in Africa, where there were kind of marauding, people who would simply grab somebody, throw a tire around their neck and set it on fire. Remember that? It was just awful, awful stuff. So people were being burned to death all the time. I was talking with Jean about this. I was saying, what the hell is this about? That people do things like that. And she said, it's really easy. If you make people afraid enough, you can do anything. What greater fear does any human being have than the fear of fire, right? Like it hurts. People jumped out of the World Trade Center, for God's sake. So, there are lots of clever devices that kind of have gotten built into these traditions in ways that are really hard to get past, because they get built in really, really early. But perhaps the most significant one is this belief that I know the answer and you don't. And if you disagree with me, you're in trouble. Let me take a break. I want to hear what you're thinking. Yeah. And by the way, I don't mind if you disagree with me.
I was gonna say I kind of felt it was a bit comforting how the witnesses believed in death, that it was just like going to sleep and that you would never return.
Yeah.
And part of when I left, I was thinking, well, that's not such a horrible thing. I can be okay with that in a way. And so that made it easier for me to leave.
Yeah. So is there no belief in an afterlife or hell or anything like that? What now?
I don't know if they've changed their beliefs since then, but when I was around, apparently there is a heaven for some. There's a certain number, and I'm among them, by the way.
I just want you to know you're screwed. just for the record.
And they say that there's no hell, so kind of like basically you just are no longer. You don't exist anymore, consciously or in spirit form or at all. You're just dead.
Oh, okay. Unless you're one of, 144,000? Wonder how often that happens anyhow.
Belief also is that once Armageddon takes place, then those people who survive it and those who are brought back from death actually transform the earth into a paradise. That's one of their fundamentals. So, one of the slogans Jehovah's Witnesses have used for over a century already is that millions now living will never die.
you grow up with this just impending feeling of gloom and doom. Like, why even try?
Yeah.
Why? I would say that at least anyone here who is about my age, and I'm going to be 46 soon, so I didn't even think I'd graduate from high school. So, you know, I'm one of that generation where I did well in school, and when the counselor said, "Hey, we're going to, you know, come in for counseling for you can select college and whatever," and I said, "I'm not going to go to college because I didn't ever even think I was going to graduate from high school or middle school for that matter, because it was always like, what are you living for? It was just like the end of the earth, the world is coming anyway. Why even try?"
Don't have a retirement account. Don't plan for the future. Because I'm against it.
Do not stir up treasures on earth.
Translation: don't go to college where somebody might teach you to think.
Amen, brother.
God damn. You know, when I was a little kid, I can remember waking up one morning about probably, I don't know, I was probably 5, and nobody was in the house, which was absolutely unheard of in the house I grew up in. And I remember going to the telephone and calling my grandmother because I thought the rapture had happened. And I knew that if there was one person, I knew if she was there, then it hadn't happened. You know, so she answered the phone. So, I mean, isn't that weird? I mean, it's always going to be 2012. What is it? Yeah, December 20th, right? No, we got one more year. Yeah, 2012. Yeah. So, I mean, so, you know, really what all this stuff does then is just sort of instill fear, and it instills terribly distorted perceptions of reality. Because part of what's getting built into these kind of belief systems is that there are certain things that are bad and cause trouble. And if you can get rid of those things, then everything will be okay. So, then there's another really, yeah, Larry.
Another complex that develops in the midst of most of our minds too. So now here in the back of your mind, you're always told that you're going to be one of these, either of the 144,000 that goes to heaven, or you're going to be one of these meek people that goes to the earth. You develop a superiority complex because now all of a sudden you walk around, you look at everybody else, and you're like, damn, you're not one of those. You're not going to make it. I am. I'm the lucky one.
Something's really screwed about that, because I just checked the membership in the Jehovah's Witnesses this morning. It's about 7.6 million worldwide. I mean,
But actually, this is what I was.
144,000, huh?
Actually, what I was going to tell you, or actually later this afternoon, in one of my talks, is the numbers in the United States has been declining for the last 10 plus years. It's the reason why I left in 97, 98, and it was a little bit over 4.5 million at that time. So they have almost doubled in size, almost, but it's in the Latin American countries. That's where the positive numbers come into play.
You know, it just doesn't make a lot of sense if we want to keep people so afraid, does it?
They also use fear of losing your family if you don't comply. And so you lose your family. If you've been raised in it, you lose your family of origin, and they will not talk to you. They ostracize you and consider you an apostate if you don't comply. And so part of like what happened to me is I kept trying to go back because I had to get better and comply and please my parents until I finally reached a point where this is ridiculous. I don't believe in this stuff, and my parents are just going to have to deal with it, and I am going to have to learn to live without them. And I can do it.
Stay in slavery and keep your mind in chain, and be with your family and your religion that you don't believe in, or choose freedom and lose everything. Freedom is much better. I'm sorry.
Well, you know, except for one thing, choose freedom and lose everything. What really happens is you choose freedom and gain the world, gain everything. Yeah, the real world. You know, sometimes the hardest thing of all for people who are. But that sounds good. Sorry, I was just.
I've already given make improvements the next one.
When you start thinking about the stuff back here that we're so afraid of, it's amazing what they really are. Probably the most sensitive, most profoundly difficult emotion back there is sadness, hurt, really deep loneliness, abandonment. You know, anger is usually secondary, curiously enough. I mean, it's there, but it's usually secondary to something else. And that's not to say it's never. And by the way, I can't spell. I'm pretty aware of that. You got my point, good. For a lot of gay and lesbian people, there's this deep, deep sense of being misunderstood. Real painful sense of that. Feeling out of place. Pretty fundamental to most LGBT people. Feeling judged, horribly painful. Rejection. So what does the church do? I mean, what does religions do? My God, they look for all of these things, capitalize on their ability to use them, right? And then exploit them. So it's a really, really kind of cruel thing to do.
None of these have taken place yet, so you have a blank slate. Get them young.
Well, yeah, the idea is to show you it'll happen, right?
Yeah.
There's a really interesting developmental thing that begins. How many of you have kids? Some of you? Okay. 2-year-olds, right? Everybody talks about the terrible twos. Well, you know, what's going on there? For the first time, the child is beginning to have some vague sense of itself as being separate from the people who take care of it. And the mission of a 2-year-old child, the developmental mission, is to learn to be independent. So what the kid's supposed to be doing is running off and exploring all kinds of things. And the ideal situation is the mother's in this room, kid goes running off to see what's in the next room, and when he comes back, there's mom waiting, right? Or if something goes wrong over here, he yells and mom comes and makes it right. Well, I mean, how often does this happen, right? So we start, if it works this way, then we encourage independence from the very, very early, from 2 years old. So by the time people are adolescents and adults, then they don't worry about making decisions. They've learned to make decisions, well, by themselves, by making them clearly. If mother happens to be anxious, we don't pick on mothers because it's easy. If mothers are anxious, or if they've got a lot of their own kind of neurotic stuff going on, little kid wants to run in here, mother gets scared and starts making the kid scared, right? Or she runs in and hovers around. Our kid runs in and bumps into a trash can and she starts screaming, "Oh my God, what's wrong?" So the world becomes this really scary place. Or the world becomes a place that looks easy and fairly uncomplicated and certainly manageable.
If I may borrow what you said earlier, Suzanne, that just reminded me of something Suzanne said earlier about how she went to this party when you were 16 years old, and her father didn't trust her enough. She found out sort of by accident because the brother, whose house it was like, "Are you leaving?" Because she was just going out to the car, I think, with a friend, and she was going to come right back in. And he sort of let slip that her father had asked him to keep an eye on her to make sure she didn't leave the party by herself or with someone else or something like that. Like she wasn't trustworthy. And so, of course, what kind of an environment does that breed for a child. That I can't make decisions on my own. I'm untrustworthy.
Yeah, sure. And then there's this other belief too. People are bad by nature. People are evil, and you got to beat them into being less evil. I mean, how weird is that? What a loving attitude, huh? Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah. Let me show you how much I love your bleeding ass. Sure, this is clever. Yeah. Let's trade places. Yeah. So, all right, how are we doing so far? Does this make some sense at all? I think the one of the most important parts of this whole thing is to start to know more about our personal responses to these uncomfortable situations. And one of the things that's most difficult about dealing, kind of getting free of religious backgrounds, is that people look for new religious explanations. It's like the classic thing: people quit drinking, but they smoke 6 packs a day. Okay. So the hard part is that there's always a temptation to kind of do these distorted reinterpretations of things that make it feel better. Anybody seen remember Dr. Laura? The radio? Okay, all right. She went on all that tear about how evil homosexuality is. And she was quoting from Leviticus. Do witnesses use Leviticus? Okay. Have you seen the one where somebody wrote to her and said, Dr. Laura? Yeah. Da-da-da-da-da. And, well, it's wonderful. It's about 20 things, and it says that one of them is, oh, God, I wish I had brought that. There's one about my neighbor cut his grass. Do I have to burn him alive, or is it okay if I let the city council do it? And yeah, right. I've decided to sell my daughter.
Yeah.
But can I only do it to? Can I do it to sell her to my next door neighbor, or do I have to go out of the county, or stuff like that? It's just, oh yeah. Bruce, Google that. Will you see if you can questions for Dr. Laura, something like that. See if you can find it. Right. And there's the one about a farmer who's planting corn and something, right?
Oh yeah, corn is eat.
Yeah. Do we have to stone him or what? I don't know what he does, but I mean, it's just absurd, and it's funny how we pick out the one that we can, who knows what the hell that's about? Yeah. Then all the projection that goes on. I mean, do you guys just laugh every time another Republican gets caught sucking dick? I mean,
have 3 times.
Still there, so is Vitter, with his horse. But I mean, wasn't that amazing? Yeah.
When he went down for going down. There you go.
A major ego defense. It is. Oh God! Suddenly, I can't think of the name of it. Anyhow, whenever people recognize something in themselves that they believe is evil, the attempt is to go out and extinguish it in other people. So the board that decides whether a movie is pornographic or not has to see it 16 times before they're sure. Then they can tell you not to watch it.
What was Shakespeare's quote?
Doth protest too much. Yeah, sure. So, one of the things I wanted to talk with you a little bit about is some of how this stuff impacts relationships. Roll those eyes, I'm telling you, yeah. But there are a couple of other things. Let me just mention a couple of other things first. We don't talk very much about the difference in shame and guilt. Any ideas? Yeah.
Would shame be that other people know what you did and you feel that they're looking down on you, and guilt is where you've done something and other people don't know, but if they did know, they'd be looking down on you?
Okay. You should see that couch.
Shame is usually something that's passed on to you, whereas guilt is something that you actually feel bad about your own actions.
Somebody else? A little bit of oppositional behavior still there, isn't it?
This is Larry.
I don't think you'll ever get that out of Larry.
Even beatings didn't work, right?
Well, Mr. Serena might
Well,
need to show up.
Somebody I know says this in a really easy way. She says, when you feel guilt, you want to say, I'm sorry I did that. When you feel shame, you think, I'm awful. So this is about the sense that I am fundamentally flawed. There's something wrong with me the way I am. This is about I screwed up. Okay? So, guilt is a more intellectual kind of thing. It says, I snatch an old lady's purse. I go, shit, that was her Social Security. I feel really awful about that. Shame is I masturbated, oh God. Yeah. So, those are pretty big things. I always think that it's interesting that religious people are taught. One of Bruce's favorite things was, I think, from. By the way, we're ex-Republicans. It's the most shameful thing of all in our lives. But we met at a Republican political meeting. Oh God, I know. That's like slimy. I wish I could tell you we met in a bookstore or, not Borders, or something. Anything would be better. We're big opera buffs, and the night before last, we were at the big patron circle thing at HGO. And we don't go very often because it can be kind of tedious. So this couple will come running up to us and start introducing themselves, and they chatter on, and they were like in their late 60s, I would think, mid 60s. Obviously very, very affluent, obviously retired, obviously looking for something to do, and kind of, oh shit, what did they hear this? I guess they will. World travelers. But it got around to how long have you all been together, and then she said to Bruce, and where did you meet? And I think, oh God, no, what's coming? And he said, this is really embarrassing. I hate to tell you, but it was a Republican political meeting, and she went, oh good. She totally didn't get what that meant. Then she started telling us what proud Republicans they are. So that was and Jewish. Now, how do you make that work? You know, did you find that, Bruce? Yeah. But oh, you found, okay. So you guys remember, but most of you've seen that. I think that's really funny. That's
I know Leviticus 11:6-8.
We're back on the Dr. Laura subject for a minute. I know from Leviticus 11:6-8 that touching the skin of a dead pig makes me unclean. But may I still play football if I wear gloves?
Ah. You know, so there's the, you know the difference here, huh? This one makes you just feel awful, like you're green and slimy. This makes you want to do something to try to make it right. Take the purse back and, you know, take the old lady out to dinner besides. There are all these other kind of weird things that go on with religious thought. Now, and keep in mind that all of this is on kind of on the overlay of the knowledge of being gay and that sense of being different. And the fear that if anybody knows, then we'll be rejected.